going to cover several topics today. I'll start with just a short overview of the pumping, how it prior to 1993 was exclusively from basal groundwater, and in the last 20 years has become a mix of high level and basal groundwater. You've got to shrink that down so it will on the screen. After that, I'll identify what we have in place as a monitoring network, what we're doing with the monitoring, and some of the results of that. And time permitting, I will talk a little bit about the Kamakana deep monitor well that we struck fresh groundwater more than 1,000 feet below sea level, and some of the aspects of what we learned from that. Okay, for this map, what I've shown in red are the wells in the south part of the aquifer. They are all basal. Keauhou Shaft, 4 Keauhou drilled wells, and Holualoa. And up through 1993, those were the sole sources of supply for DWS's North Kona system. So, and supplant some of it to by the high level. Next slide. Over this 20-year period, starting in 1994, all the way through 2013, that's the addition of the wells when they came on and the amount of pumpage. And over the last 4 years or 4 or 5 years, it's been between 4 and 4.5 MGD. Next slide. What that has allowed is if you go over the period back in here before the high level pumpage, this is all basal groundwater. High level comes on. It has allowed DWS to decrease the amount of the basal pumpage, replacing it with high level. So if you look at the numbers here and the numbers here, the high level pumpage from these 5 wells is now averaging a little over 4 million gallons a day. A little over 2 million gallons a day was simply to reduce the amount of pumpage from the basal wells, and the other half, about 2, was to make up for the increasing demand over that period. This is a 20-year period, 1994 through 2013. Next slide. Maybe a little higher, if you can. Our monitoring network today includes basal wells and very recently high-level wells, DWS's high-level wells. I'm going to show you where those, I think you've seen some of them today. This is the Kamakana monitor well just up the road here. It's the one that we took down way below sea level, hit fresh water. It is now sealed back up to 1,000-foot depth, so it's a monitor of basal groundwater conditions. It's in an optimal location because 2 of these high-level wells, QLT and Honokohau, are directly up gradient, and except when they have pumps down for maintenance or repair or replacement, they are run 24/7. So this well is in a great position to reflect if any impact is occurring to the basal ends as a result of this pumpage. I'm using Koloko 2 here as another monitor well, and it's also strategically placed because Hualalai and the Palani well, which is yet to come online, but will hopefully by the end of the year, early next year, it's directly down gradient from them and also directly up gradient from the park. I've been doing salinity profiles in the Koloko 2 well since 1996. I also do some salinity profiling in the O'oma wells. I know I started in 1996. I can't find the data. I can find the data back to 2002, and that's what I'll be presenting. Very recently, we put water level recorders in high-level wells, one in Keauhou here, one in QLT, and one in Palani. And as soon as the pumps are back in at Hualalai and Honokohau, we will add 2 more. So we'll have 5 of the high-level wells with water level recordings matched to what we're doing in the basal lens. Next. Okay, we'll start with water levels that I'm recording at the Kamakana well. This is the ocean tide at Keauhou. I have over the years compared it to what I measure as a tide in Honokohau Harbor, and it's pretty right on, so I'm comfortable using this tide at Keauhou. This is the record with semi-diurnal tidal response in a Kamakana borehole in the basal groundwater of the Kamakana. When you look at something like that, it's impossible to tell what's going on. Next slide. So what I do is use the moving 24-hour average of the data so that I can remove the semi-diurnal tide from both the water level recording I make here and also the ocean tide. Next slide. And when you do that and just look at this 24 moving averages, you'll see that almost all of what you see as water level variations in a basal lens are nothing more than the basal lens riding on mean ocean level changes that are caused by large-scale meteorological events that are weeks to months, sometimes even longer in time. Next slide. What the data tells me over the period that I've done water levels in Kamakana, these elevations are relative to different datums than, but essentially I've averaged them over those periods of time, and you can see the height difference over time. If the pumpage directly up gradient was impacting the basal lens, the flow in the basal lens would be decreased. We'd expect to see the basal lens drop relative to the ocean. And what has happened actually is over that period of time, it's up by about 1/10 of a foot. May or may not be significant, but what it does show is that we're not seeing a declining basal lens in the region of the Kamakana monitor well. I've just over a period of time, and I've been doing this kind of stuff for a long time, more than 40 years. And what I have found in permeable basal lens, such as what we have here between Keauhou Airport and the old Kona Airport, is a very thin basal lens in a very permeable lava formation that moves up and down with a tide, which makes interpreting groundwater level changes difficult, going on meaningless. And I learned this first when we looked in Ewa, when Oahu Sugar closed down in 1994, I think October. Series of salinity profiles over a period of time have turned out to be a far better way to look at what's happening in a basal aquifer than measuring water levels. We measure the water levels anyway, but it's really eyewash. You get a salinity profile like this. The blue line is the salinity, red is the temperature. You have the lens itself and a transition zone that goes through a midpoint of ocean water salinity about there. Next slide. What I do is I track two indices for each of these profiles that I do over a period of time. I go down 10 feet in the water and say, what's that salinity? I go down to where the salinity is 50% of seawater and I say, how deep is that? Because over a period of time, if the lens is shrinking, what will happen is that this salinity profile will move out like this. It will get thinner and saltier. If the lens is somehow getting more water than previously, this line will move over and down like that. So I track that salinity, those two parameters over time to tell you what's happening in the lens. This happens to be Ewa, but it illustrates the method I'm using here at Kamakana. Next one. When I watch what happened when Oahu Sugar closed down and stopped pumping out of the Ewa aquifer and expecting to see the water level rise, what happened in the next 6 weeks is a drop 0.6 feet, mean level, drop 0.6 feet. How in the world could that happen? Well, it turned out the ocean level dropped 0.6 feet. And when I took a look at the water level data, I had about 10 locations in Ewa. What, over a period of 10 years after that happened, how much water level changed because Oahu Sugar had gone out of business? And the reality is maybe it was 0.05 feet, but I wouldn't swear, I think it's less than that. So you can't really see much in a very permeable aquifer. But if you watch these indices of the salinity profile, they're very illustrative. On the top is the salinity 10 feet into water, and you have Oahu Sugar closing, a big storm that happened on election night in 1996, a change to using treated wastewater rather than pumping the basal groundwater out there, and you see changes that we're now kind of in a fairly, since about 2007 or late 2006, almost stable condition. And this is the midpoint of the transition zone going all over the place. I can see big changes here in the aquifer that water levels can't show me anything at all. Next slide. A little further up, Roy. So this is the Kamakana borehole after we finished it at a depth about 995 feet so that it just looks at the basal lens here, and all of this portion of the hole that was drilled to 1,700 foot depth is now cemented off. So I look at the Kamakana well, the two parameters, what's the salinity 10 feet in the water, how deep is it to get to the midpoint of the transition zone, and I plot that over time. This is just a comparison. One of them is May 2014, a very recent one, April 2010, and you can see over that period of time, visually there's not a whole lot of change in the salinity profile. This is a tract of salinity 10 feet into the water and where the thickness of the midpoint in the transition zone in the Kamakana well. And what you can see over that period of time is pretty much what the water level data said over time, is that at Kamakana we have not yet, at least, seen any impact to the pumpage of the high level upgradient. Go ahead. There are a little higher, 2 other wells that they're not really strategically located. They're in Oma parcel, which is north of Keauhou Aquifer. One of them I call Oma Mauka and the other Oma Makai. And they have the water temperature here and the salinity there. And I track those things over time and have tracked it since 2002. That's the Mauka well. Next slide. And this is the Makai well. Next slide. And this is over a period of time, 2002 to 2014. This is the salinity in the top of the aquifer, and this is the depth of the midpoint of the transition zone. Actually seems to be getting a little fresher and possibly a little thicker, suggesting that maybe the lens is slightly more robust. But the reality is, when these wells are close to the shoreline, the data is quite noisy. And so if I go very frequently and see how noisy is it, this is an indication of how noisy that data is. Next slide. But that's the Mauka well. And this is the Makai well, same thing. This is the salinity at the top and thickness of the lens, and really not much change. Next one. This is the Koloko 2 irrigation well. I think you guys pointed out Koloko 1, which is on the south side of Hinalani. Koloko 2 is a little further away from the road on the north side, and it only goes about 18 feet into water, and the data from the last half a foot or so, it just stuck in the mud, not useful. But I always get this salinity profile, something that looks like this, and a noisy, how slow I lower the instrument in, I get this noise here, pretty typical. It does not go far enough into the water to show me the midpoint of the transition zone. For this well, I simply tracked salinity at various depths into water. Next slide. And that's what this is. It just shows you salinity at 2 feet and 5 feet and whatever is underneath there, 5 feet, 10 feet, and 15 feet in the water. And you can see since 1996 through to today, pretty much have not seen any change in the Koloko well. Certainly not anything you could attribute to the pumping in the high level aquifer. Next one. A little higher. Okay, this is a profile through the Kamakana well as it's today. It's about, as I say, 990 odd feet. Salinity is curved like this, temperature curve. This happens to be a thing that we did in April 2010 at this depth. They had a problem with, every time they had a problem with the drill string in some fashion or other, we pulled it out, I put my instrument down, and at every depth I did that, it lined up perfectly with the ones before. And this happens to be the last profile I made before we hit the fresh water at depth. Next slide. It's kind of important to take a look at what that temperature profile does, because the temperature comes down, hits a value of about 61 or 2 degrees. And then if you look in the ocean, you have to go way deep, almost 700 feet, before you get a temperature of equivalent to what we see in the basal lens at that depth. There's a temperature reversal. And then down here, basically, in an area where the salinity part of the profile says nothing is moving, it's all identical, it looks like it's just sort of a temperature exchange between the ocean and groundwater that's basically not moving at depth in that part of the well. Next slide. Okay, we got back to drilling after we pulled out the string and made that profile, and at about this depth into below ground, 1,050 feet, we ran into fresh water. And the fresh water here is coming out of the hole here, moving back up the hole. We don't have a video, but it's flying up the hole and carrying all kinds of stuff with it and mixing around. And it's mixing to a level, and it goes all the way up here. Basically, no more mixing for hundreds and hundreds of feet before it comes back into the shape of the lens above. And the temperature of the fresh water at the bottom of the well, we were in the basal groundwater is about 59, and out here it's about 67.5. So we got about 8 degrees change over a foot or two of the drilling when we finally penetrated into the fresh water and started flying up the hole. So that's the profile you get with the borehole completely open and the fresh water just flying up the hole. Go ahead. This is another profile. We kept on going to see if it were thicker, and the reality is we ran into salt water at depth. It's actually slightly hypersaline, and the temperature out here obviously a lot warmer than the basal lens. Go ahead, next one. This is just a comparison of the salinity profiles. The blue is before we went into the fresh water, and the green is after we did. And up here it mixes back basically to up there. It's just a comparison of the salinity profiles before and after hitting the fresh water. And the same thing, this is a comparison of the temperature profile in basal groundwater before hitting the fresh water, and then boom, out here we're into much warmer fresh water, flying up the hole and mixing back to the level. A really important thing, we tried isolating the zone and pump testing it to see if it was a developable quantity of water in this location, and the reality is it wasn't. We got a very small yield, quite a bit of drawdown, and the water was slightly brackish. So it really wasn't going to be developable as a potable supply at that point. But one of the things that came out of that monitoring that we did at that time, which is going to be really important when you hear the presentation from Don Thomas about his conformable layering as being what I consider to be the most plausible explanation of what's creating this high-level groundwater. This is the Keauhou high tide, and this is the tidal response in the high-level groundwater more than 1,000 feet below sea level. It is about 60% of the ocean's tidal amplitude and only lagged behind a very short period of time. And in fact, this tidal response, I think next slide, is in fact much greater than is the tidal response in the basal lens right in the same location. There's a hydraulic connection between that high-level groundwater and the ocean offshore that if the high-level groundwater was contained by dikes or some other intrusive features, you would not expect to see anything like that.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Don Thomas, and what I'm going to do is talk a bit about the chemistry of the water and applying an analysis of the chemistry to understanding how the water is moving through the system. Maybe just a minute of background on myself. I work at the University of Hawaii. I've been working, looking at groundwater chemistry now for 30-odd years, and have done some drilling over on the Hilo side and up in the Saddle. And what I've found in a very brief summary is that the groundwater flow is very highly structured or highly impacted by the structures, the buried structures inside the island. And the movement of groundwater inside the island is much different from what we had generally thought it to be. So if I could have first slide, please. Okay, what I'm going to do is talk about a couple of different models for how the groundwater is moving within the system. The first model, next, is what I'm calling the dike impounded model, and it's a somewhat simplified version of the model that, the conceptual model that the National Park Service and USGS have proposed for the groundwater system over here. And next is what I'm calling the layer cake model. Essentially, the island is built like a layer cake. We have lava flows one on top of the other, and within that layer cake we do have confining formations, confining layers that can be both conformable, as Tom was saying, basically that are lying at the same angle as the lava flows, but also we can have dike systems within that layer cake model that will also affect groundwater flow. Next. And so this is somewhat simplified version of the model that the National Park is using to project what is going to happen with development of the high-level water. And in summary, the idea is, go ahead and I think next slide, see what I got there. I'll go back then, but back one. Okay, so we have a system of dikes here, and the dikes really are necessary to account for the fact that when we drill wells down here in the coastal environment, we basically see elevations of fresh groundwater a foot to 3 feet above sea level, quite low. But as we move inland and we get up to an elevation of about 1700 feet above sea level, suddenly there is a significant jump and the water level rises to 100, 200, almost 300 feet above sea level. And we need to have some form of confining system in there to make that transition from a basal system, groundwater system, to this high level water. And so their basic model is, next slide, is that we have water, rainfall, recharge coming into these systems and then passing through this dike system and ultimately then discharging into this very thin basal lens that we have in the coastal environment. And that basically is how they model water flow and assume that if we are withdrawing water here from this high-level aquifer, then that's going to deplete the amount of water that's coming into the coastal aquifers. So next slide. And so then a layer cake model, next, is a little bit more complicated. And the idea is that, okay, we have these layers of lava flows, but we can also, that are quite permeable. We know Hawaiian lavas are, especially on young volcanoes, are quite permeable. But within this layer cake, we have some layers that are actually much, much less permeable than the average lava flow. And so if we have recharge coming into this system and moving down towards the shoreline, it can be intercepted by these layers and essentially hold this water back and generate these high-level aquifers. Now, the first time we saw this was actually in the borehole I drilled in Hilo, where we were drilling in Mauna Loa. We made a transition into Mauna Kea, and when we passed through that transition, we hit a series of soil and ash layers that, in fact, are accumulating water and allowing water to flow well, fresh water to flow well below sea level. So next slide. So the basic idea then is that we have this water that's being impounded here by these layers. Some of it is leaking through, and it's quite likely that some may be discharging into the basal aquifer, but we also have some flow that maybe is going below that basal aquifer. Next slide. So how do we test those models? Next. We can look at the field data. Where do we see water? Where do we see water flow during the drilling? Next. We can look at the water chemistry, in particular the salt content and the isotopic content of the water. Now, this gets a little bit esoteric for the non-specialist, but the oxygen isotopes can tell us quite a bit about where that water, that groundwater, entered the hydrologic system. Next slide. Okay, what we see, and there's a lot of background to this, I'll be happy to answer questions on it, but in the interest of time, I'm going to be very brief. What we see is that the first rainfall, as oceanic air moves over the island and moves upslope, the first rainfall that falls has an oxygen 18 value of about -3. However, as the moist air moves upslope, the oxygen isotope ratio falls substantially. And we've seen this both on the Hilo side as well as the Kona side of the island. So we can use the oxygen isotope ratios to tell us approximately where that groundwater came from as rainfall. And so this is an internal sort of tag or tracer for us to use to sort of backtrack to where this water came from. Next slide. Excuse me? Oh, okay. The ocean has an oxygen, actually, and I did mean to mention, thank you, Roy, that these values are in reference to a standard, and that standard actually is ocean water. So the ocean water here has as the standard has a 0 oxygen 18 value. The clouds themselves have a -12. These kinds of evaporative processes and condensing processes will affect the oxygen isotope ratio. So next. We can also look at the age of the water and try to infer something about how long it's been underground. Next slide. So we'll test the dike impounded model first and look at the field observations. Next. So the depth to water, okay, again, the dike impounding system is really used to explain why we have that high level water in the Malca regions of the Keauhou Aquifer. Next. However, it's also been observed that we have perched water in the Malca region. When some of these wells were drilled, next slide, I believe the Palani Ranch well was one, the Como Monitor well was another one, where during drilling it was observed that there was a relatively thin water table well above essentially the continuously saturated zone at depth. And so these water levels appeared at a substantially higher level than the current level of the high level water. So next. And so with this dike impounded model, basically there's no mechanism here for developing a perched water body. We're assuming that all of this rainfall is going into the dike system and then passing through that dike system and ending up in the basal aquifer. Next. So next, basically the model doesn't adequately explain why we're seeing these perched water tables. Next. So we can look at the salt content of the water. Next. And in the drilling that Tom just talked about in the Kamakana well, next. Okay, the Kamakana well located right here, and in this Keauhou deep monitor well, what was observed was drilling down to the water table, encountering fresh water, drilling through that freshwater layer into salt water, but then continuing to drill and finding salt water below, or excuse me, fresh water below. So we're seeing multiple aquifers here. Next. Again, in the dike impounded model, we don't see any opportunity for that kind of a feature to form. Next. Next. So in terms of being able to account for that, it doesn't do that. The isotopic content of the water, the oxygen isotopes, next. Again, we're assuming that the rainfall here is infiltrating down into the dike system and then discharging into the basal water. This is what I'm trying to depict here with these arrows is the isotopic composition. This is the heaviest of the oxygen isotopes, or the highest concentration of oxygen isotopes. As we move up slope, the oxygen isotope composition drops off. So down near the shoreline, we're seeing an isotope ratio of about -3 to -3.5. We get up here in the mid-slope regions and we're seeing -4.1, 3.8, 4.3, and so forth. And then further up at higher elevations, -5 and to -6. Now, what I'm also showing here, though, is the length of these arrows more or less corresponds to the amount of rainfall that's entering the system. So near the shoreline, we only have about 13 inches per year, 13 inches, 8 inches. But as we move up slope, we start to see an increase. Now, these values were taken from John Ingett's report on the recharge for the Keauhou Aquifer. So this is our region of largest rainfall right in here. And okay, these numbers here are the elevation sort of at that point for the rainfall. Next. So we look at the isotopic compositions of the well waters here, and down here in the Mackay area, we're seeing values of about -3 to -4. Okay, this number is actually for the underlying seawater. Over here, -5, but again, relatively low values. We go up here into the high level water and we see a much, much more oxygen depleted water, minus 6.9, minus 7, minus 7.2. Next. Again, we're looking at direct infiltration, and we can assume that the water here is an average of all the rainfall that fell above it. Basically, all of this rainfall is moving into the system, moving downward, and ultimately into the basal lens. So next. Next. And next. Okay, now we look at what, okay, this is, VWA stands for volume weighted average. So we're looking at what the isotope composition at this well, okay, this is at about the elevation of the high level wells. The volume weighted average of the majority of the rainfall above it is actually minus 4.3. If we take the volume weighted average of everything up to the summit of Mauna Kea, or excuse me, of the summit of Hualalai, it's only minus 4.7. Okay. This is a substantial difference. Next. Okay. Again, instead of being minus 4.7, we're seeing minus 6.9, minus 7.2. Now the problem is, in order to get this kind of isotope composition, oxygen isotope composition at this elevation, we would need to have a volume of water, a volume of recharge equal to the entire recharge here coming from an elevation of more than 10,000 feet. I would argue that that's a little bit unlikely. Next. So, next. So we have to give the oxygen isotopes a fail on that test. Next. We then look at the age of the water. And I was able to get several samples of groundwater from the high-level wells. Next. And these are the values that we got. And I found them to be tremendously informative, but also quite surprising. In the southernmost wells, we're seeing ages of about roughly 3,000 years for that water. In the northern wells, the Keauhou well and the Keauhou well, the age is even greater. Now, I think these two wells probably are influenced by actually either geothermal or magmatic carbon dioxide. In looking at the age, the magmatic carbon dioxide has essentially an infinite age, an infinite age. It has no carbon-14 activity. So if any of it gets into the water, it will look like an older age than it really is. But we can also see that in the carbon-13 isotope ratios of that carbon dioxide. And these wells do show evidence of magmatic carbon contamination. They also show an elevated sulfate concentration, which is also consistent with geothermal fluids affecting, although only mildly, but still affecting these wells. But these ages appear to be real. The values of the carbon-13 isotope ratios look exactly like they should. So these look to be real values. Next. So again, this is the Keauhou well, the Keauhou well. These two, as I say, show some evidence of the values being affected by magmatic carbon, but the Queen Liliuokalani Trust well, let's see, I believe I've got a Keauhou and Waiava well. These are extremely old waters, or much older than we would expect. Next. Next. If we have direct infiltration. Okay, the hydraulic conductivity of rocks that are about the same age as Hualalai should be somewhere between 10 to 1,000 feet per day. The horizontal conductivity is somewhat lower than that, but even under those circumstances, it should take no more than a year or two for rainfall falling on the surface here to actually make it down to this dike impounded water. So this is very difficult. The age of this water is very difficult to explain if we have this direct recharge coming into a dike impounded system. Next. Next. So finally, next. We have to say on the age, the dike impounded system does not adequately explain the data. Next. So let's look at the layer cake model. Field observations, next. Okay, depth to water, next. And again, high level water here, basal water down here, next. And again, these confining formations are allowing water to stack up. I'm not saying where this water is coming from at this point. I will later. So we can account for the high level water by these layers, these impermeable layers, be it soil or ash or be it trachyte flows. Any of these kinds of lava flows can impound water like this. Next. We can also have water that's infiltrating. Some of it will come through and accumulate into these high-level aquifers, but some of it is also going to be carried next as perching water. Next. This perched water layer. Next. Next. Basically carrying this water directly down to the basal aquifer without entering the high-level aquifers. Next. So next. So we can give that a pass. Next. Salt content of the water. Next. Fresh salt, fresh. Next. And basically, if we have drilling down here in the basal aquifer, we will go through a saltwater saturated zone into fresh water and then ultimately back into salt water, very much like what Tom saw. And again, we saw this is where really we discovered this system in Hilo. This was the first time that we had seen something like this. We found fresh water, about a 400-foot thick layer of fresh water, 1,000 feet below sea level. I estimated, Paul and I are still working out on an agreement on that, but 100 million gallons a day, 50 million gallons a day, moving through that system, a very large volume. Next. And again, basically, we can account for this multi-layer system. Next. 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 Okay, oxygen isotopes. We look at those again. We have, again, this very divergent isotope ratio between the high-level water and the basal water. Next. And again, if we don't have all of this water, all of this rainfall in the high-level zone getting into the high-level water, then it makes it somewhat more plausible that high elevation rainfall on Hualalai is actually recharging these systems, and we can get -6 isotope ratio water in the upper elevations of Hualalai, but it's also entirely plausible that we're getting water into this system either from Mauna Loa or from the Saddle region. Next. And so again, we can account for that. One interesting aspect of the water that we've seen, we look at the water from the Kamakana well. I was able to get a sample of that fresh water. And this is the isotope ratio, -6.5, well within the range of the high-level water. Now, we can ask, okay, well, what happens, what does the perched water look like? And with the help of the Water Commission staff, we were able to get a sample of perched water from the Como well. Isotope ratio of that water is -3.58. It looks very much like the rainfall that's falling within this region. So again, what we're saying is that this water is being intercepted, is being carried down, some of it anyway is being carried down into the basal aquifer, is not getting into that high level. Okay, next. Next. So we give that a pass. Next. Age of the water. Again, without belaboring it, next. And again, the water is old here, somewhat younger here, next, next. And again, as long as we're not allowing all of the local rainfall to accumulate into these aquifers, then it's a lot easier to explain the substantial age of this water. And as I say, I kind of suspect that some of this water is coming in either from Mauna Loa or coming in from the Saddle region. Next, 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 next. So, next. We can draw several conclusions from the observations. Next. Layer cake model is consistent with the well data from the Kamakana and Keauhou monitoring wells. Next. The bedded confining layer can act as a perching formation, and perched water has been observed. Next. The interception of local rainfall recharge and redirecting it downslope can account for the divergent isotope ratio values of the high level water. It also can account for the somewhat lighter isotopic composition of the basal water without it having to pass through the high level system. Next. Isotopic compositions of that high level water still requires that the recharge come from an elevation higher than Hualalai. Next. Next. Okay, the age of the water is consistent with coming in, next, from either the Saddle region where we have found high level water. For those of you not familiar with the work that I'm working on currently, we found what appears to be a dike impounded system up here with water standing at about 4,600 feet above sea level. So there appears to be a substantial water body here, as well as, of course, high level recharge here on Mauna Loa could potentially have access to the Keauhou Aquifer. Next. Next. There are variations in the overall isotopic compositions throughout the Keauhou Aquifer. I don't want to say that this is a perfect model by any means. I think we need to do some more work to really fully understand. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but I think the layered model better fits the data that we have than the dike impounded model. Next. The conclusion that high level water must be infiltrating into the Mackay Aquifer, and this is one of the conclusions that came from the National Parks petition, basically is not required by the isotope data that we see. Next. The evidence suggests that withdrawal of water from that high level aquifer will actually have negligible impacts on the Mackay aquifers. It appears to be an isolated system that is not contributing significantly to the basal aquifer. Next. Nonetheless, my recommendation in terms of long-term development of that water is that we do definitely need to monitor those water levels and track what's happening as further wells are drilled, as withdrawals continue. And I believe that's it. Thank you.